Hey everybody, my name is Boulevard and welcome to Tournament Tactician. This is coming into you on a Saturday morning as opposed to Friday afternoon for the first time because I did have the Giant Slayer TV Fight Night cast last night. Didn't have an opportunity to get this video out because I do have a lot that I need to go over. There's a lot of changes that happened in the meta now that we've gotten through the first week. A couple of things have settled, but there weren't really any open tournaments this weekend, so I don't think this coming out a day late should affect anybody too much, but we're still going to go over the tier list because it is important to track where things are at going into the seasonal next weekend. That's right, it's next weekend. It really is creeping up on us, so I'm going to go over the tier list and let you guys know what I think some of the best decks for the tournament scene in Legends of Runeterra are. So on last week's Tournament Tactician, I didn't include any newer archetypes because it was kind of hard to tell what was a flash in the pan, what was actually going to be tournament viable, what was only good for ladder. I think I've been able to narrow down a couple of the decks that are going to be sticking around. There might be a few more, but the jury's still out on them as I only saw them once, and if I see more of them this weekend, be sure to let you guys know going into that seasonal next weekend. Very important. So we've got Lee Sin, Shen Fiora, Burblefish, Mind Meld. These are all still tier 1 decks, very solid. I actually want to talk a little bit more about Lee Sin in a minute here, but first let me go over these newer decks like Invoke Control, and you'll see that I still have it listed as mid-range. I couldn't really think of anything else to call it because Invoke is what I called the Zoe Diana Mountain Scryer decks with the Atrocity Splash and things like that, but nobody's really running Mountain Scryer anymore. Instead, we've got a Shadow Isle version of the deck that is, it cuts Scryer, it's running the Box, Withering Wail, Vile Feast, Grasp of the Undying, which is why I call it Control. It's basically just Invoke with removal and a little bit less Invoke, and it's really just looking for ways to kill the Twisted Fate. The Piltover and Zon version is doing the same thing. It throws in Mystic Shot and Get Excited and Thermogenic Beam. Just removal for Twisted Fate is essentially what these decks are looking to do because it is a champion that is notoriously difficult for Targon to deal with. There's also a Tri-Beam Improbulator version that won the online league series last week, and I am really curious about this list. I haven't seen anybody else running the Tri-Beam in their Piltover and Zon Invoke, but if you want to run Tri-Beam and then take out the Zoe that we typically see for Ezreal, because this is usually a Zoe Aphelios deck, then I could see the Tri-Beam maybe being one of the more popular versions. And then Bilgewater, this is just what I took from the rank 1 NA player, Kevor. He's running it on ladder. This actually is a Mountain Scryer list, and the only Bilgewater splash is 3 copies of 8-Punch Pablo, aka Boxtopus, for you to combo with that Crescendum from the Aphelios. But this is actually a Mountain Scryer deck, and it's rank 1 on ladder, so I thought that was pretty interesting since everybody else has cut the Scryer. Now, as far as tournament viability on these, I'm a bigger fan of the Piltover and Zon version of this deck. I think that Targon Bilgewater, I really actually like Tom Rocket right now, which I'll get into in a second here as well, but I think that the Piltover and Zon just has the cheapest, most consistent removal, and I don't think that Withering Wail is necessarily as good against Burblefish as a lot of people make it out to be, and even Grasp of the Undying is a little bit sus when you throw in things like Suit Up into the equation, which really just helps dodge removal. And then we also have TF Aphelios. I actually think this deck should be in like tier 3. Let me explain. So the deck is extremely powerful, currently widely regarded as one of the best decks in Legends of Runeterra. But if you try to run this in a 3-deck tournament with 1 ban, you are never going to get to play it. It will get banned 100% of the time. And Twisted Fate and Aphelios are 2 of the best champions in the game right now, so pairing them together to get them both immediately taken off the table is something that you can do if you're extremely confident in your other 2 decks that you will be consistently playing for the remainder of the tournament. But I don't know that that's necessarily the line that you want to be going. It also does take Tom Rock off the table. Not the biggest deal in the world, but I do think that when you're powering all of your champions into 1 deck and it's just getting banned, it's not the best idea. And I'd be very surprised to see this be very popular in the seasonal because, as I mentioned, it should just be getting banned pretty much every time. I would not recommend running this. I definitely like going for a more balanced lineup. And then everything else on the tier list was just kind of adjusted accordingly. Right now, we're in this kind of transitionary phase where we just got out of a couple months of you pick 3 power decks and that's the way you go for it, into a little bit more of a counter strategy. Players are generally finding 1 or 2 decks that they want to pick on and either adjusting their builds or adjusting their lineup for it. But when we're talking about the seasonal tournament, as I had mentioned, there aren't any opens this weekend, so I do want to focus primarily on prepping you for the seasonal tournament. You can't run counter lineups, and I said that last time, I'm going to reiterate it here. There are just too many players in the tournament and too many unknown factors for you to say, yeah, all 5 of my opponents are going to run Lee Sin with any amount of confidence and then bring an anti-Lee Sin lineup. You can try and metagame it and think 3 levels ahead and say, oh, well, like, this is where I am on ladder, so I'm going to go against a Gauntlet player. Gauntlet players are stupid. They're going to run triple aggro. That's not the case. That's not how that works by any stretch of the... What are you talking about? You're going to get your ass slapped by a guy who brought a normal lineup because Gauntlet players are just normal players. They're not all aggro brain NA smork you down. Like, you can't just bring an anti-aggro lineup because you think you're going to play a Gauntlet player round 1 and maybe 2. That's insane. But one of the reasons that I bring up such polarizing matchups and trying to like target out specific things is Frostbite Foundry is a deck that's picking up a lot of popularity, and Sejuani Teemo and Ezreal Teemo are both equally viable, but they have very different matchup spreads, and it's a little bit obvious as to what they are. Basically, if Frostbite's good against you, Sejuani; if Frostbite's not good against you, Ezreal. But even then, there's a little bit more nuance to that unfortunately I'm not going to have time to get into in Tournament Tactician, because there are a lot of other things that I want to talk about, like Starspring. Starspring is a deck that's been coming back really big, and a lot of people have been wondering why, and there's a couple of reasons. Number one is that in the current meta, Starspring is not win condition A. It's not the primary way that you're winning the game. The primary way that you're winning the game is Tahm Kench. We talk about all these backline champions that are difficult to deal with, the meta kind of revolving around Twisted Fate removal, as we saw with the Invoke decks. None of that deals with Tahm Kench. Aside from Mind Meld, the Burblefish Mind Meld deck, Tahm Kench is going to pretty much solo carry you against any Piltover and Zon deck, and that includes the P&Z Aphelios. It's got one of the best Lee Sin matchups in the game, which I think that in this format of everybody talking about, you know, matchups are getting closer all the time, you talk to any player, you might get a different answer on a matchup. A lot of them are going to say that most things are 50-50 or at worst 60-40. Tahm Rocket into Lee Sin is one of the more polarized matchups in Legends of Runeterra right now, which is a consistent theme for Tahm Rocket, as in the previous seasonal, Fearsome into Tahm Rocket was one of the most polarized matchups in Legends of Runeterra. So I think that Tahm Rocket just has really good matchups across the board, and is probably one of the best decks that doesn't take anything out of your lineup, because unless you're going for Twisted Fate Aphelios, I can't think of another Bilgewater and Targon deck in the meta. The champions aren't going to take anything out of this. You can still run this alongside like Fizz Twisted Fate and then Lee Sin or something like that. As far as Zoe versus Aphelios and Lee Sin, just quick caveat, I'm not sure. I liked Zoe initially more, but after watching a little bit more of it, I'm starting to get a little bit more on that Aphelios. If you're running Veiled Temple, conversation for a different time. Try to go more in depth on that on the next Tournament Tactician if Veiled Temple still sticking around. But for now, I still want to continue to go down the tier 2 and talk about some of these decks. Scouts, we haven't seen. They've pretty much been gone. Cephalopod did just win Fight Night last night with a no Grand Plaza Bannerman Scouts list with 3 Stony Suppressor, but advised that this is probably not something you can run in the seasonal, because the 2-deck format of Fight Night, of course, wildly different, much more targeted. He gets away with something like that. Mistrates might not be a bad option. This is kind of my dark horse for right now, because, as I mentioned, Tahm Rocket is kind of on the up and up. A lot of these decks don't deal with burn particularly well, but I think that players are still trying to figure out, Pale Cascade just got nerfed. What is the splash that I need to put in my Mistwraith deck? The only Mistwraith player I've seen since the nerf was running Troll Chant as the splash, but back in the days of open beta, when we all figured out that Mistwraith was a broken deck, we were all experimenting with the splashes. A lot of players were running Mono Shadow Isle, and then we just started, throwing in different thing after different thing. And Mystic Shot was something that was run for a time, just getting that little bit of extra over-the-top damage. And with Burn being so good against some of the top decks, like Burblefish Mind Meld, a very stagnant life total deck, you want to throw Mystic Shots and maybe even a copy of Aftershock or something like that into your deck, it's probably going to work out for you. Atrocity, not something that these Burblefish decks deal with particularly well. Hell, throw a Veiled Temple in there for all I care. Start slamming down your big boys, but it's a conversation for another time. Discard aggro is getting experimented with a little bit, but for the most part, I don't love this deck. I never really have. It's got some inconsistencies. Feel the Rush and Anivia, I moved down to tier 2 from tier 1 last week. The whale piles just do not deal with Burblefish Mind Meld as effectively as people think they do, and I feel like these are some pretty inconsistent decks, which brings me to a point that I've been talking to a lot of players about this week, which is one of the powers of Burblefish Mind Meld is that it is just arguably the most consistent deck in Legends of Runeterra right now. You see a lot of decks that we call inherently inconsistent. Take Shen Fiora, for example. If you get a bad hand with Shen Fiora, there's no single top deck that's going to get you out of that. There might not even be 2 or 3 top decks that can get you out of that. But if you're playing Burblefish Mind Meld and your hand sucks, all it takes is a pick a card and you're back in the game, baby. It's really hard not to find an answer within those 4 cards that you're going to draw on your next turn to either start to accelerate your own game plan or at least draw you almost an entirely new hand. And Feel the Rush and Anivia are some of the more inherently inconsistent decks in Legends of Runeterra. They can fold to themselves a lot, they have really high curves, Vengeance and Ruination can be really awkward to try and get down the timings on against decks like this, so while they might actually be favored against Burblefish on average, Burblefish is just so much more consistent than these decks, and you're actually just going to end up faltering to your own deck in matches that you should have been winning, and I think that these soft counters don't really work when we just take the consistency into consideration, and I would hate to see somebody come in with this Anivio or Feel the Rush deck trying to target out Burblefish decks and just end up losing because their deck didn't function, and it's something that we see all too often. I think that you're much better off not trying to pick on the Burblefish and maybe just banning whatever Twisted Fate deck your opponent brings. There are other Burblefish decks out there, but for the most part, all of them are going to be running Twisted Fate, so if you want to come in with the ban TF strategy, that's perfectly fine. It's kind of what I imagine most players are going to be on. And then I just moved some of the decks that we're not seeing anymore into Tier 3. Targon Grand Plaza, non-existent. Have not seen this at all. Frostbite midrange. I think I had spoken last week about how Draven Ezreal and Draven Swain I thought was going to start to perform a lot worse because we're not in a mid-range meta. Things like Ravenous Flock and Scorched Earth just are not getting the kind of value that you need them to, and those were some of the more powerful tools in the deck. Frostbite midrange, kind of along the same vein. It's down for now. We will see it again in the future as the meta shifts back into a more mid-range centric focus, but for now it's a very combo-oriented style of gameplay. Lee Sin, obviously a combo deck, Mind Meld Burblefish, really just taking these big combo turns, kind of like Nightfall used to do, but much more consistent and much more explosive, and doesn't die to the same kinds of things. So yeah, unfortunately, Frostbite Midrange just a little bit too fair of a deck, but it'll definitely come back in the future. Don't you worry about that. And I think I'd also mentioned, I think it was War Room where I mentioned that Draven Ezreal, while Scorched Earth and Ravenous Flock and these execute style abilities aren't good, Tribeam Improbulator still is, and that's one of the reasons that I'm such a big fan of the Piltoverns on Invoke Control. Now, I don't really have an opinion on the Tribeam versus non-Tribeam version. I certainly don't think you're going to be made fun of if you don't bring the Tribeam, or if you do bring the Tribeam, rather, because it is definitely going to be the less played version of the deck. But honestly, I don't really have an opinion of it. I haven't played Ladder too much since hitting Master, so I haven't gotten to try out any of these cool new decks. When I'm scrimming with people, I'm not playing the Tribeam version, if that helps at all. I think that most people are not going to be on that, but something that if you do think that Tribeam was the thing that made Draven Ezreal that good and you still want to play it, there is a deck that you can fit it into pretty organically in that Invoke Control, I think. And, maybe try Aphelios Ezreal, not Aphelios Twisted Fate. You can try Aphelios Twisted Fate, not in tournament. I said that already. So Aphelios Ezreal, take out the Zoe, put in the Ezreal. That even opens you up to still run Lee Sin, Zoe. But yeah, that's kind of the tier list. And that is going to do it for me this weekend. Sorry again that this was a day late. Had that cast last night. And I don't think I have anything on Monday. The LBR is over, so War Room should be on time this week. I know that was a day late this week as well. There's a lot of tournaments going on during the week and weekends, and it's good for me to be busy, but it does throw off the schedule a little bit. I hope that you guys can bear with me for that. So thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to, subscribe. I know that a lot of YouTubers lately have been talking about if they don't tell people to subscribe, they forget to do it. So this is me telling you to do it, because War Room and Tournament Tactician will be coming at you every Monday, every Friday, and then sporadic videos as I feel like doing them. As you can see, I haven't felt like doing them in some time. Nothing really that I want to talk about that I don't get to cover in War Room and Tournament Tactician. So yeah, it's kind of a nice little Easter egg whenever I decide to throw another YouTube video in there. But Shurima's spoilers should be starting soon, and while generally I'm not somebody to do spoiler reviews, if the mood strikes me, we'll see what I can do. So make sure to subscribe as we continue down this path of new cards coming out, and yeah, just throwing my analysis out there every week and hoping that you guys can get some tournament success off of the advice. So thank you so much for watching. Till next time, my name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.